All right, well, we'll go ahead and kick off here. So give Ruby as much time as possible here. So would like to introduce Ruby Sinreich for her session today. I'd like to encourage everyone to post your questions in the Hop-in chat here, and I'll be monitoring the chat during her session. And then at the end of the session, I will keep all those questions and then kind of ask Ruby those for you at the end so that she can answer them during the question and answer time of that. But with further ado, I will hand over to Ruby so we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Brian. This is really exciting. First time presenting in Hop-in and stuff like that. One of my favorite things about Drupal camps in particular, but any gathering like this, is actually the connections with other people. And as you all know, with Hop-in, it's a little hard to know like what's going on. I can't actually even see who else is in here. So I would love it if, while I tell you about myself, if you could each pop a short introduction into the chat and just say who you are, and maybe especially today, like your role or the way that, I like to say the way you use Drupal. Like some people do site building, back-end development, front end. Some people do everything. So please share, if you'd like to, please share a little about yourself in the chat so we all know who's here and we can connect with each other a little bit. So I am Ruby Sinreich, and I work at Moms Rising, which is a national advocacy organization. We're really awesome, and you should check us out at momsrising.org. And I live in Durham, and which is, for those who aren't from Asheville or the area, Durham is about 4 hours away from Asheville, so not really that close, but I was gonna go in person. And I have been making websites since, let's see, since about 1993, and I've been playing with Drupal on and off since 2005. There's some parts I know really well, and there's other parts of Drupal I don't know at all. And a little bit more about me. Also, I'm a mom, and I have been working in nonprofits or in higher education for 25 years. The way that the Hop-in recordings work are that it's going to record all the things that are visible. So some of the times while I'm talking, I'm going to turn my camera off. Which is a drag, because when I'm in a session, I really like being able to see who's talking. In fact, I learned something yesterday. Yesterday, I went to Wes's excellent CSS training, and I learned that my comprehension is higher when I can see the person who's talking, even though you'd think you could just listen. This is also why I don't like podcasts. But anyway, so I apologize in advance. I'll turn off my camera once in a while, but I'll turn it on when we're chatting. It is so nice to see you all here, especially some of you whose sessions I've been to also at other camps and cons, and I really appreciate you coming. I was saying to Brian, I'm optimizing all my windows, so I think I can watch the chat too, although I obviously won't be paying tons of attention to it. Okay, so the cardinal rule of any kind of software development: know your user, right? This is why we do personas and user stories and user testing and all these things, because obviously what good is any software we're making if we don't understand the person who's going to use it and how they're going to use it. A lot of people think of the content editor in Drupal, like that role, as the end user of Drupal, and that is a very, very important one. And it is great that we've been improving that experience. But site builders are also really essential users of Drupal, and our ability to do our job effectively helps those content editors ultimately have a better experience too, because we're often the one who's really creating the end experience that they're going to have. Some site builders work as part of a team alongside other developers, designers, project managers, other types of folks. But a lot of site builders also work for very small organizations, like nonprofits, small businesses, government-ish, public media, education. And in a lot of those settings, we don't have a whole team, which I'm going to talk about more. So we're often doing a lot more with less as site builders. let's see, I'm following my notes so I don't miss anything. As I was saying, it's site builders that put the pieces together and make everything work for everyone, from content editors to the first-time visitors to the front end of your site. We can sometimes be the linchpin of the project, but we're not very well understood by people who are making those tools that we use sometimes. You'd be surprised how much we struggle to do things that are really easy for you sometimes. Or conversely, certain things are much easier than you might think it would be for us. So my goal today is to help you better understand the site builder experience. So of course, these are going to be generalizations. Big disclaimer, all the things that I share don't apply to every single person doing site building, but hopefully put together, it helps you get a sense of what it's like. All right. So in 2016 at DrupalCon in New Orleans, Dries presented the results of the State of Drupal survey, which apparently he does each time there's a major release of Drupal. And Drupal 8 had just come out in November of 2015. And one of the things he was looking to get a sense of in the survey was how much attention should be given to different types of users in terms of what parts of Drupal to work on. He was proposing initiatives and things like that. And as you can see here, content authors, the very highest priority, but site builders also a distinctly higher than developers. And of course, you can't neglect any of these groups. And I also know that there's a lot of, in my research for this session, I noted a lot of interesting debate about this. And as the way things are going with Drupal 8 and 9, as you all know, it's not a very site builder oriented direction that Drupal is taking. But I still a lot of organizations, small organizations, really rely on site builders. So we do need to be able to do things too. Interestingly, I was at DrupalCon New Orleans in this session, and in this talk, Dries said, we also need to do, something for non-technical users like content authors and site builders. That didn't land on me so well. I was like, I gotta turn on my camera for this. I'm not a non-technical user. I've been building websites for 25 years. I know what I'm doing. We have a lot of skills. And actually a lot of site builders are not just site builders, especially in small organizations. We end up doing a lot of different things. So like for myself, for example, I also create themes. I also modify other people's modules or, things like that. We're doing user experience. We're doing configuration. Sometimes we have to manage our server, and we're frequently doing project management, and we have to support our users. So a lot of times we are generalists where we have our fingers in a little bit of everything. It's especially true at small organizations. But we don't actually want to do everything. And because we're generalists, we're not the biggest experts on certain topics. And when a lot of times we'll read instructions for something and it says, and then go run this script on your server and yada, yada. And of course, we either don't have access to the server, or maybe it's a little bit beyond our typical skill level, especially if we're not doing that all the time. One of the things I also find is, for me, the kind of work that I do, I only need a local dev environment about like once a month on average, sometimes more, but sometimes less. And every time I go back to use it, something else is broken. Lando's throwing a new error, whatever it is. And then I have to spend hours troubleshooting it, like every time. So I find that it's not really worth it to have a local dev environment. In my case, I prefer to use like on Pantheon, they have multi-dev sites, and I use those as if they're local dev spaces, right? But then Pantheon doesn't offer those to small potatoes clients like me, only to big agencies. Another one of the site builders who gave me feedback on this talked about how they can't create modules and patches and things like that because someone else is in charge of their server. She's in a higher ed environment, right? So she's not doing her system administration, and she's got to get someone else to do that. That becomes a very expensive proposition just to apply a patch or something like that. So we actually are technical users. We can be very, very technical, but we're not like the biggest 10x developers. What we have is very small teams and small budgets, right? So we're doing a whole lot with a little. In some ways, we are like developers, but with our tiny budgets, we're not so interested in being on the bleeding edge. We don't want to use the latest cool thing, the latest version of Drupal every time it comes out, especially because until Drupal 8, major level Drupal migrations are basically building an entirely new site. Again, an extremely expensive and time-consuming proposition, right? So since we aren't big 10x developers, we do a lot of things to be more efficient, like taking advantage of modules and libraries that already exist and things like that. And we need hosting that also works for us out of the box, because we don't have our own system administrator, unless we unfortunately work in a larger institution where the system administrator doesn't let us do cool things. But we have to take advantage of what there is, and the newest cool thing isn't always the most useful for us. This is one thing that I feel like especially falls through the cracks for the people who are working on Drupal and Drupal core, because of course, developers want to do something that's new and interesting and cool. Like, I don't blame anybody for wanting to do that. But the things, just because it's new and interesting doesn't mean it's actually accessible to anybody. And especially when you go to Drupal events, especially DrupalCon, you always hear people talking about the latest versions. Like at DrupalCon next week, there's going to be presentations about Drupal 9, and even I think there's at least one that's talking about what should be in Drupal 10 and stuff like that. But guess what? A lot of us are still using Drupal 7. The vast majority of Drupal sites that are out in the wild are running Drupal 7. Less than a third are even on Drupal 8. Let that sink in, right? And then, so a lot of us not that excited about Drupal 9, yay. Although I will say, as you can see, very excited about the extension of the end of life of Drupal 7, which was going to be, the support was going to end not this next year in November, but now it's been pushed to 2022. As a Drupal 7 site owner, I very much appreciate that. It's not that we don't want to improve, but a migration is extremely expensive. I'm hoping, I know that this is going to be much better after we make it to Drupal 8. That's like the promised land that I've been waiting for years. So I'm very excited about getting there. But please keep in mind that a lot of us aren't using the newest and coolest, and we still need it to work. Otherwise, people start to leave Drupal and go to the other open source content platform. So another thing about efficiency is that a lot of us aren't spinning up new sites all the time, like folks who work at, if you work at, in a development shop, small or large, you're creating new sites all the time. And so the tools that are useful for you for spinning that up, not always useful for us. I did, one of the site builders I talked to is in higher ed, and she does have hundreds of sites, but she's not working on all of them actively, but she does have to support them all. But me, I have 2 sites to take care of. So a lot of these power tools that allow you to do stuff for lots of different sites, or to create new sites, like from Lando and spinning things up, I really don't have any need for that. I don't need to automate those types of tasks. So I'm really focused. What I do know is I know the hell out of my site, but I don't need to be making lots of new sites. And as I mentioned, we don't always have access to our servers, so that's another reason that some of those tools aren't always worthwhile. And as I said, the investment of time to get this whole local environment working, sometimes not worth it. I actually, I don't use Composer, right? I'm only on Drupal 7. And so often when I ask for help in different places, people will be like, oh yes, Composer command this. But I'm like, do you want to spend a week setting up Composer on my computer? Because probably not, especially for a Drupal 7 site. So speaking of which, we have to figure out a lot of things on our own, especially when we aren't on big teams. For example, I'm the only developer at my organization, and that's very common with nonprofits, especially. I am the web department. So we actually rely on documentation. It is so important for us. And sometimes Drupal's documentation, not so great. I frequently find myself landing on the like searching for fields API, different things to figure out what the right variable is for something. That's actually one of the best parts. But I have also experienced in Contrib where I was trying to use a module and it would say, this relies on this library, and you click the link and it goes to a Russian spam site because it hadn't been updated in years. The domain had even expired, right? Like that was not being taken care of. I've also seen people who maintain modules and there were requests from users for like Drupal 8 documentation for it, and the maintainer was like, it's not important. You know, devs don't need that, basically was their attitude. But if you're making modules, those for the most part, it depends on your module, of course, but a lot of those are very important to us as site builders because we're not doing custom code on things. So we need the documentation, and we need to know whether it's going to work for us. The other thing is a lot of times we can't tell how something's going to work if it's not well documented, and so we have to go through all the effort of actually installing it and using it and all this trial and error. And again, very, very expensive for us. That's very hard. I'm actually going too fast, which is fine. I think it's fine. But this is one of the most important parts to me. A lot of folks really, especially these days, don't really see site builders as that essential to the Drupal world because there's like devs going to make things cool, and then there's end users going to make nice content. And increasingly as Drupal 8 and 9 get more, I want to say enterprisey or more technical, there's less and less of a role for site builders there in some ways. But site builders have been essential to Drupal. And I honestly don't think Drupal would be as successful as it is if it wasn't for our involvement much earlier on. Let's take a little trip back in time. Back in, is it 2000 or was it 2001? I think Drupal's about to turn 20. I thought it was 2000, but now it sounds wrong because it's not 20 yet. But a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away in college, Dries created this forum software, which he later named Drupal. Not a lot of people had heard of it, although he was doing some great work and he had expanded it out already. But as you all know, one of the things I often tell people about what makes Drupal different is that it was born as a community tool. And that's why when Howard Dean ran for president in 2004, it was such an amazing grassroots organizing tool. For those who weren't around then, I know not everybody's as old as I am. The Howard Dean campaign was one of the first campaigns to really use the internet as an organizing tool as opposed to just a one-way marketing channel. And they used Drupal to create little sites for really anybody who wanted to have one. So if I wanted to have like, moms of left-handed kids who are queer and single who live in the Southeast, like, let's make this community site. And that would be my site, and I could find my people. And it was incredibly effective, especially for a sort of grassrootsy campaign like his, where he didn't come into it with a lot of big money or name recognition. But there were people who really liked what he had to say, but they might feel like they're the only person who was getting it. But with these online communities, they could connect to each other and go, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. I'm part of this huge movement. And that gave them the confidence and the energy to go out and be activists and campaign for him. And it was an upward spiral. And really a lot of that had to do with the way they took advantage of Drupal. His Drupal site was spun off into a distribution called Civic Space. It was originally called Dean Space, and it was spun off into Civic Space And one of the interesting things that I've noticed, I'm one of those nerds, you know, some people are like a little obsessed with Drupal.org profile ages, I guess because that data's there. I am too. So whenever I look up somebody's Drupal.org profile, I always make note of like how old their profile is or how long, you know, it's been there. And if you look at those on people's profiles, a lot of the people who are like the key people in Drupal now, core contributors and things like that, a lot of them joined in 2005. And I did too. That's also when I started using Drupal because I was interested in it. I saw the power of that, and I was a grassroots organizer who was trying to figure out how to do it online. And so Dean Space and then Civic Space brought a lot of attention and showed the power of a community-focused site like Drupal. And again, that's one of the things that was unique about it from the start. And that was appealing to grassroots organizations and nonprofits. And so a lot of people who didn't have big engineering departments, especially in the 2000s, right, who wanted to have a powerful website, found that they could do a ton with Drupal. And that's because at that time, there was so much a site builder could do. I mean, there's even more now, but you didn't have to know PHP to come in and make an incredibly powerful site. And that led to a lot of Drupal evangelism, especially in the nonprofit community. And that did a huge, huge part to promote Drupal and to make it as popular as it actually is now. So check out all those profiles and see how many of us came in 2005. But as I mentioned, things have been changing. So this is also, as you can see, the dates line up with these roughly with the major distributions, or rather major versions of Drupal. And this is also from Dries in 2016, where the more and more powerful Drupal gets, the less accessible it is for everyday users, for small organizations, and it's becoming more and more, as you all know, more and more of an enterprise tool, which has other advantages. But in a lot of ways, it is leaving us behind. And the grassroots use of Drupal, which was so powerful, is really going away. People are migrating to other tools that they are finding easier. And also, as I know you all probably know, Drupal has been working to emulate some of the strengths of WordPress, and WordPress has been emulating some of the strengths of Drupal. And as they approach the singularity, it's a lot of where we lose people, because if they can get the job done with WordPress, they actually should. So Drupal is losing a lot of those sort of grassroots small users. So, but we're really important, and we are what makes Drupal awesome. So please don't forget that we aren't non-technical users. We know tons of things, and we are working with very small teams and small budgets. We are working on just a few sites at a time. We have to figure things out, and we use your documentation heavily. And we're what makes Drupal awesome. So as I said, I went very fast, so there's lots of time for discussion. I wonder if anybody has particular questions or even things they want to push back against. If you have like a different experience than what I'm sharing, I would love to hear about that. I'll take a moment because I know chat is slow. Wow. It's amazing to think of you as starting out as a site builder, Mauricio, because like I think of you as such a pro now. Oh, I should read this for the recording. Mauricio says, Drupal is very empowering. My start was as a site builder. Being able to create useful websites without having to code kept my interest and fueled my motivation to learn more and more. Yes, exactly right. I mean, I'm learning more and more too. Martin asks, other than documentation, how would I like a module maintainer to better support me as a site builder? That's a great question. Well, there's two parts of documentation. There's the how to use it part, but also the requirements side of the documentation is pretty important. One of the things that might be helpful is thinking about how we'll use it. Like I was recently evaluating modules that allow you to make a pop-up modal in front of your site. And a lot of them I couldn't figure out, like, how much, does the content inside it have to be a node, or do I have to custom program that content? Can I control which pages it shows up on? Can I control which roles it shows up for? Those are all questions I had about those modules, and some of them described the answers to that better than others. The other thing is we can't easily implement patches sometimes. So patches have their place, but for me, it's easier just to install a new version of the module, for example. Don't assume that we can easily like do a little coding over here, or always install libraries in other places and things like that. Sometimes we can. And of course, good interfaces, good admin interfaces are always helpful for us. But really, it's that the evaluation at the evaluation level is one of the most important things. It's helping us understand what your thing is and how it other things. Thank you for asking that. My supervisor at Moms Rising is the CTO, and he used to be a programmer in his previous life. And so that's one of his big ones, is like documentation and requirements, because that's bit him in the butt a couple times. Okay, from Jeff. Generic problem with the Drupal.org community. There's no distinction between module building and other communities, and getting help dumps you into module building discussions. Yeah, the fact that all discussion happens in Git issue queues is demonstrative. It's exceedingly confusing, and I'm a part-time programmer. Yeah, that's a great point. That's true of all the support channels that we have, really. Like the support channel in Slack too. If I ask a question there, there's a bunch of developers, they're going to give me developer solutions. And I'm like, I can't do that. And so a lot of Drupal folks don't even use Git. And it's hard to know which places to look for those different things. And I'll be honest too, I mean, you can probably tell from this presentation, but sometimes I feel a little defensive about the fact that I'm not what some people would call a real developer, although I am a developer, damn you. But that also makes it hard to ask questions, because I want to be like, I need help with this, but I can't do all those things that y'all do. It's hard to say that, which is why I wanted to do this presentation. So yeah, I think I completely agree, Jeff. It's really hard. And again, it used to be simpler. I mean, it used to be we got all our help in the Drupal forums. Another place we end up going a lot is Stack Overflow. Like nobody doesn't use Stack Overflow. And that too can be, a certain type of answer. Jim says, a lot of the up and coming CMSs are slick with drag and drop interfaces and fun to use features for managing content and architecture. I know a big takeaway from this presentation is the importance of the site builder role, but should we also be focusing on giving these tools to content authors? Can we give layout builder, taxonomy, menus, views, UIs to editors one day? That is such an interesting question. Because of the way Drupal permissions are structured, as y'all know, we really never let those end users have access to stuff like changing a taxonomy, or blocks is another example of that too. It's like, all or nothing access to blocks. So I'm not giving my authors and editors access to that either. Which is why some people use nodes for that instead, or those kinds of things. In some situations, it makes sense for like the small personal sites, like the way Drupal actually used to be used for personal blogs. I know that may be shocking, but for those sort of small sites or small organizations, maybe. Or maybe you would want to give a user access to that. But of course, if it's a personal site, then they do have access to everything. As speaking for like, from my situation where I work for an organization of about 40 or 50 people, and maybe half of them are using the site regularly to post blog entries and things like that. In my case, I would definitely not want them to have access to that, right? Because I have a brand across the site, or other consistencies, navigation, things that I want to maintain. So I don't really want them to do that. And that's an interesting thing, because when I see people advertising like, oh, now you can drag and drop layout builder, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, Do you have any idea what like views look like in Drupal 4.7? Like I can deal with no interface, basically. Like as long as there is an admin interface, if there's no user experience, I can make it work. So as those things are getting, as those interfaces improve, they are accessible to more people. And in some cases, like things like paragraphs and layout builders, it makes a lot of sense for those to go to the editors, because I might have a coworker who's putting together a complicated post that has charts and pictures and different parts, and they do need to be able to put those parts in there. But the site-wide tools like menus and views, maybe not quite as much. Although, I mean, anything being more accessible, I think, is generally better, but maybe less of a priority. Cerise says, as a noob to Drupal 7 and pretty much coming in as an editor, having access to some of those tools is confusing and made it easy for me to mess up sites really badly. Yeah, that's exactly my concern. Like, I don't want my coworkers to be at risk of, you know, destroying the site navigation, because then who knows how long it would take me to fix that. So, so as I was saying, like, everything being more accessible is generally better, as long as it doesn't have other impacts, which it sometimes does. But I would say that's not, to me, that's not the biggest priority. Like the content authors and editors need to have a good authoring experience, and there's definitely room still for improving that. But I don't think they need as much access to like the site structure, personally. So yeah, it's a great example. Mauricio says, I think site building is a much needed skill. When you're able to code, it's easy to resort to that when facing a challenge or trying to implement a new requirement. But if we do not take the time to test existing solutions, we might be overseeing modules that have more features and are backed by the community. Many times those solutions are actually much better and flexible than what can do under tight deadlines and budgets. I have seen many creative and powerful solutions from site builders. That is exactly right. And then we end up with proliferation of modules and things when actually there's a good module, and if somebody had just built a plugin that works with it, they could have like made that whole module better, and then it would be more accessible to those of us who aren't coding our own things. It really feeds back more into the community to look at what's already there and work with it, which is what site builders sort of do automatically. That's a really good point. Thank you, Mauricio. And also, I do see a lot of things getting over-engineered. About 10 years ago, the site that I managed had an outside developer that did a lot of the heavy stuff. They were working on the site before I got there. And often we would ask for a feature, like there was something with like an accordion thing, and we're like, can we have these so that they're all expanded when the page starts instead of collapsed, or some kind of request like that? And they said, oh yeah, sure. And then they come back later and they're like, okay, our developers spent a week on this. And we're like, really? It wasn't actually that important to us. We just thought like this is something that could be switched on and off, or like a line of code or something. So engineering isn't always the smartest approach to every problem. And you do get stuff then that's like over-engineered and becomes burdensome, you know, processor heavy and things like that. So it's not always, coding shouldn't always be the first resort. All right, well, we don't have to take up the whole. I wanted to give thanks to some other folks, other site builders. First, the group, as I can't remember if I mentioned this, but I had originally conceived of this session as a panel of site builders, like telling our stories. And so some of those other site builders helped me develop it as a pitch for DrupalCon. But I'm not doing it at DrupalCon, only you get to see this. But I really appreciate their input into it. And also Rachel Lamb and Alyssa Thomas, who gave me feedback and gave me some of the examples that I shared with y'all. And also I want to thank all the people who dissed site builders and called us non-technical and built things that frustrated us, because that inspired me to get it together and tell our story too. Thanks to everyone, and thanks for coming, y'all. I really appreciate it. Are there any last questions? Thank you, Jim. or what would make module evaluation easier? Simply test me. I never use that. I keep thinking I should use that, but that doesn't tell me how it's going to work on my site. But I do think, as I said, like some of those explaining, seeing screenshots of the interface can really help, especially if you don't have time to write out all the interface stuff. So on the module project page, seeing screenshots of the interface will let me see what controls and things I would have. That can be really helpful. And also responding more promptly in the issue queues actually is something that would be really helpful for all contributed modules, right? As we've all seen some of those modules where the maintainer just doesn't really reply in the queues. But if we not only ask our own questions, but we learn from seeing other people's questions, everybody does that. So just more responsive maintainers in the queues could be helpful as well. Thank you.
Awesome, Ruby. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. That was a awesome presentation.